Hey guys, in this video I'm going to teach you how to multiply and divide radicals and how to put them in their simplest forms. So up at the top of page 27 it says that radical expressions are in simplest form when you follow these three rules. First, the radicand contains no perfect square factors other than 1. That's what we learned in the last video. 2, the radicand is not a fraction. That means you can't have a fraction underneath the radical. And 3, there are no radicals in the denominator of a fraction. Okay, so your two rules here that we need to know is that you're allowed to multiply radicals, which we kind of learned in the last video when we took a radical and split it into two. So if you have two numbers that are both under radicals, you can multiply them together to make a single radical. Same thing with division. If you have one radical divided by another radical, you can divide and make one single radical. So let's see what that looks like. When I'm doing these kinds of problems, the first thing that I always like to look for are numbers that are perfect squares. So if I'm looking at number 1, I know that 16 is a perfect square. Now remember the rule. If I can divide a radical by a radical to get one single radical, I can also go backwards. So this is the same thing as radical 7 over radical 16. But 16 is a perfect square, so that gives me 4 on the bottom and radical 7 on the top. Now, you're allowed to have a radical in the numerator, so right now we're okay. We just need to see if there are any perfect squares other than 1 that go into 7. And there is not, so that's it. That's my final answer. Number 2, radical 18 over 3. Now, 18 is divisible by 3, but the 3 is not under a radical, so therefore you cannot do the division here. So what we're going to do is see if we can simplify the radical 18 on top. I know that the square root of 9 goes into 18. That's the biggest perfect square that goes into it. So square root 18 is the same thing as radical 9 times radical 2 over 3. Now the square root of 9 is 3. So now I have 3 radical 2 over 3. And 3 over 3 is just 1. So that's 1 radical 2 or just radical 2. All right, number 3. Once again, we have no perfect squares. So what we're going to do is see if we can simplify on the inside here. So what I like to do is put the number in as a fraction in my calculator and see if it simplifies, which this one does not. It's not going to simplify for us. So what I'm going to do now is do the square root of 80 over the square root of 45, and I'm going to simplify from there. So let's find the biggest perfect square that goes into 80. Let's see, we're going to start at 64. Oops. That one doesn't work. 49 doesn't work. 36 doesn't work. 25 is not going to work. But 16 works. So up on top, I'm going to have radical 16, radical 5. And I know that 9 goes into 45, so that's radical 9, radical 5. The square root of 16 is 4, so now I have 4 radical 5 on the top, and the square root of 9 is 3, so I have 3 radical 5 on the bottom. Now, radical 5 over radical 5, I can actually divide those since they're both radicals. That just gives me 1, so they essentially cancel out, and I'm left with 4 over 3. No more radicals. All right, number 4. Both of these numbers are perfect squares, so I'm going to take the square root of each of those. The square root of 64 is 8, and the square root of 36 is 6. And 8 over 6 simplifies to 4 over 3, so that would be my answer. All right, number 5. 81 is a perfect square, so I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of that, and I'm going to get 9. And I know that the square root of 18 simplifies to radical 9 times radical 2, so I'm going to do that. The square root of 9 is 3, so now I have 3 radical 2 over 9. And then these two numbers are not in square roots, so I'm going to see if I can simplify them. 3 over 9 is the same as 1 over 3, so I get radical 2 over 3. You can put the 1 there if you like. All right, number 6. Both of these are perfect squares. The square root of 64 is 8, and the square root of 4 is 2, and 8 divided by 2 is 4. All right, that's all the division ones. Let's move on to some multiplication. So remember what I said, if both numbers are under a radical, you can multiply them together. You have a couple different options when you do these. You can either simplify first and then multiply, or multiply and then simplify. Regardless of which method you choose, I always try and look for perfect squares again first, to just make it more easy on myself. 12 and 3 are not perfect squares. So let's go ahead and multiply those together. So 12 times 3 is 36. So now I have 3 radical 36. Now 36 is a perfect square. It's 6. So now I have 3 times 6, which is just 18. All right, number 8. 64 and 4 are both perfect squares. The square root of 64 is 8. The square root of 4 is 2. 8 times 2 is 16. All right. 8 radical 3 times radical 16. 16 is a perfect square, so I'm going to take care of that. 8 radical 3 times 4, because the square of 16 is 4. Now for this one, I can multiply the 8 and the 4 together because neither one of those are radicals, but the radical 3 is going to stay the same. 8 times 4 is 32, and then I have radical 3. And that's it. 3 does not simplify. All right, number 8. Neither one of these are perfect squares, so I'm going to multiply them together. So we're going to do 18 times 3, and you get 54. So I have 1/3 radical 54. And I believe 9 is the biggest perfect square that goes into that. Yep. So this is going to give me 1/3 radical 9, radical 6. The square root of 9 is 3, so now I have 1/3 times 3, radical 6. And 1/3 times 3 is just 1. So I get radical 6, or 1 radical 6. All right, number 9. Square root 3 times radical 30 over radical 5. None of those are perfect squares, but 30 is divisible by 5, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So now I have the square root of 3 times 30 divided by 5 is 6, so the square root of 6. I can multiply those together because they're both under radicals. 3 times 6 is 18, so that's the square root of 18, which we've already simplified twice in this video. That's radical 9, radical 2. And then finally, the square root of 9 is 3, so you get 3 radical 2. And that's it. All right, number 10. Both of these are perfect squares. The square root of 49 is 7. Square root of 4 is 2. 7 times 2 is 14. And that's it. That's how you would multiply and divide radicals.